Sunday Baroque Conversations is made possible by the Friends of Sunday Baroque and is produced at WSHU Public Radio in Fairfield, Connecticut. I'm Suzanne Bona. Thank you for listening. Don't miss an episode of Sunday Baroque Conversations. Subscribe on Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. And please leave us a review. If you want to find out where you can listen to our weekly show, visit our website, sundaybaroque.org, for a station list and our 24/7 stream. Again, that's sundaybaroque.org. Princeton, New Jersey native Sarah Kirkland Snider is a composer. She honed her craft at Yale School of Music and Wesleyan University, and her list of teachers and mentors is a who's who of luminaries. Martin Bresnik, Aaron J. Kernis, Ezra Latterman, David Lang, Christopher Rouse, to name just a few. Her music's been commissioned and performed by top-tier ensembles all over the world, an impressive roster that includes the Boston Symphony Orchestra, Chicago Symphony, Cleveland Orchestra, New York Philharmonic, and many other orchestras, as well as Emerson String Quartet, Eighth Blackbird, A Far Cry, The Knights, and Roomful of Teeth. In 2026, Sarah Kirkland Snider released her album featuring 4 of her orchestral compositions called Forward into Light, a commission for the New York Philharmonic inspired by the American women's suffrage movement. And Sarah Kirkland Snider joins me on Zoom to talk about her compositions and her life in music. Hi, welcome.
Hi, thanks so much for having me, Suzanne.
So let's dial it back to the beginning first. How did you first get into music?
Oh, boy. Well, music, gosh, that was like, I think my first love, I remember being a little kid and just singing all the time. My parents couldn't get me to stop humming and singing. And it was just, looking back, I was just constantly composing little melodies, melodic ideas in my head. And it was strange because I didn't come from a musical family. My dad loved music, but my mother is tone deaf and completely amusical, in fact. So it was really, I think they didn't quite know what to do with me, but I eventually started piano and then cello, and got more serious about composition along the way. But I still, I was a late committer to the profession because I didn't see it as a viable career option. It was always like something that I loved to do, and I never connected it with like a professional aspiration until much later.
Interesting. When you say later, how much later?
I was 24 when I decided to get serious about this, and I'd never had a composition lesson. I was not a music major in college. So I had to go back to square one, and I had to cobble together the equivalent of a bachelor's in music. I was living in New York at the time, and so I took a lot of music courses around the city. I started studying composition with a wonderful teacher named Justin Delajoyo, and then I eventually wound up starting a master's at Yale at the age of 30. So. Which is quite late for the career.
Yeah. Well, what did you think you were doing? What career path were you trundling down at that point?
Yeah, so I majored in psychology and sociology, and I thought I was either going to go into social work or public policy of some kind. I was working as a paralegal for the Center for Reproductive Law and Policy, which is now called the Center for Reproductive Rights. It was an offshoot of the ACLU, but yeah, I was working there as a paralegal for years and after college, but at the same time, I had friends who were involved in theater, and they were asking me to do music for their theater productions. These were friends from college who knew that I composed for fun. So anyway, that got me composing a lot on the sides, on the weekends and at night, and I started to realize, wait a minute, I'm a lot happier doing this than I am doing anything else. So
Wow. When you were writing these compositions for these various friends and acquaintances, were you also playing the music, or were you strictly doing that as a composer?
I was playing some piano I was playing the piano parts, but there were like voices involved and strings, and so I didn't do that part. But yeah,
Oh.
I did the piano parts. Yeah.
Wow. So this is very intriguing, and it's sort of it puts a different light on my next question for you because what
Sure.
I notice is that the scope of your compositions it's really really broad. I mean, you have these sort of intimate instrumental solos. There's vocal music, then there's large scale orchestral music. There's kind of everything in between, and I wondered how you approach each new composition from scratch. And especially now, I'm curious, given that, what you're saying is, you kind of came later to it. So having such a broad a set of tools in your toolbox is even more impressive.
Yeah, it's really I feel very fortunate that I've had the opportunity to write for a variety of media and commission opportunities. I love all of it. I love the intimacy of solo works, and I absolutely adore writing for orchestra and everything in between. I just finished an opera, and that was a whole new world of discovery for me. And yeah, I just love wrestling with melodic ideas and trying to figure out a story
Mhm.
within or that can be involved with these melodic ideas. That's always for me the most compelling part of the process.
Wow. I'm so glad you brought up the opera because I was going to ask you about that as well. Your first opera, Hildegard, is a pretty recent addition. Hildegard von Bingen, the 12th century abbess and mystic and herbalist and kind of everything else. Another pretty
Yeah.
amazing woman of the 12th century, especially. How did you approach that? And how did you come to choose Hildegard?
So I had been thinking about writing an opera on her for like 20 years. When I first found out about her in my 20s, it was actually through reading a book about migraines. And this wonderful neurologist, Oliver Sacks, had written this book on migraines, and he was theorizing, or he was popularizing a theory that her visions had to do with her migraines,
Mm.
auras from her migraines. And I have chronic intractable migraine myself. So that got me very curious about her. As I mentioned, I wasn't a music major, so I didn't know of her before that. But then I went down this rabbit hole of reading about her, and she's just the most fascinating woman, and her life story is utterly just astonishing. So I always thought, if I write an opera, I would like to do it on her. And then the opportunity eventually presented itself through working with this wonderful producer, Beth Morrison. And one thing led to another, but I didn't think that I was going to write my own libretto. That was kind of a surprise along the way. I tried working with a couple different librettists, and one of them was a Hildegard specialist and didn't want to play with her timeline, so that didn't work. Another one was a wonderful collaborator, but I had too many ideas about the way that I wanted the story to go. And you can't really tell a librettist how to tell their story, of course. So, eventually everyone kept saying, like, you need to write this yourself. So I eventually came to do that. But yeah, it was really a wonderful, wonderful experience.
Oh, very cool. So let's talk about Forward into Light. It's both the name of the album and then it's also the title cut. So let's talk about the piece first. Take us through. It's inspired by the women's suffrage movement in this country, and kind of take us through, like, again, kind of your thought process, your inspiration, and then how you actually implemented this piece.
Yeah, so the New York Philharmonic had this wonderful project called Project 19, where they commissioned 19 women to celebrate the centennial of the 19th Amendment, which granted American women the right to vote. And they told us we could write on anything we wanted. Some of us were assigned to write for chamber ensemble, some for orchestra. Um, but when I started, that got me curious to read about the suffrage movement because I felt like my American history course had kind of glossed over it when I was in high school. So I became fascinated by it, reading about it, and I knew that I immediately wanted to write a piece about it, and not so much a piece that tried to narratively depict what happened in the movement per se, but something that was seeking to distill like the emotional and psychological contours of faith and doubt and perseverance. How these women stayed focused on this goal after, obstacle after obstacle and heartbreak after heartbreak and, 100 years of inactivity or a seeming lack of progression, how a movement stays focused and keeps moving forward. That was really the heart of what interested me. So I wanted to write music about that. And that's where the piece came from.
Mm.
And there's other pieces on the disc which are not related to the suffrage movement, but also share themes of perseverance and resilience.
Let's talk about those as well.
Yeah, so there's a piece called Something for the Dark, which was commissioned by the Detroit Symphony. I was fortunate to win a competition that they had in 2014. And the prize was to commission a new piece. And so my best friend lives in Detroit and had just moved out there and was part of this urban renewal project where they're, farming old, bombed out parking lots and creating organic farm and keeping bees and all of that was really of interest to me, how they were converting this land and changing the city into something new and like a phoenix rising out of the ashes again. So I wanted to write a piece about that. And I found this wonderful poem by this Detroit born and raised poet, Philip Levine, who was a former US poet laureate. And he wrote a lot about Detroit's working class. And he had this wonderful poem about his wife, planting or preparing flower beds in the winter, um, and how he saw that as a metaphor for rebirth and resilience. And it had this beautiful line at the end that said, "Out of whatever we have been, we will make something for the dark." So that's where the title "Something for the Dark" came from. So there's that piece. There's also a string orchestral arrangement of a string quartet that I wrote for the Emerson String Quartet for their final commission a few years ago for their farewell tour. And I decided to change that piece a bit, arrange it additionally for string orchestra and harp. Um, and so that piece is called Drink the Wild Air. And then there's a piece called Eye of Mnemosyne, which is a large multi-movement work for orchestra and film, which was commissioned by the Rochester Philharmonic and in celebration of George Eastman's centennial. So he was the inventor of Kodak, and they granted us access to the Kodak archives. And this wonderful filmmaker, Deborah Johnson, and I created this piece together, which is about memory and cultural innovation. And she ties it all together with references to the Greek goddess of memory, Mnemosyne.
Yes, yes.
So,
Oh, love
so that's
that.
where that title comes from.
That's awesome. Um,
Yeah.
if someone were to say to you, "Oh, that's interesting. You're a composer," how would you describe your style? Do you have a style?
I mean, anyone who knows my music knows that I've written a real range of pieces in the sense that, my first major work that I became known for had drums and guitars and was very pop influenced,
Mhm.
pop and rock. And then, but that was not the first piece I'd written. That was just a particular assignment that I was asked to do in that style. And so that piece brought me a certain amount of renown, but it also came with this idea that that was kind of my style or that's what I did when actually had written much more music that was strictly classical before that.
Mhm.
So I feel like my whole, I don't know, Ovra, whatever journey is really about narrative and atmosphere and emotion. Those are the three things that I think I'm the most interested in. And
Hmm.
what style the piece winds up in really depends on whether or not I'm working with a text, whether I have explicit directives from the commissioners, you know, um, the personality of the people who I'm writing for. I like to, that experience of writing the first piece I mentioned, Penelope, which was the rock inspired one. It was very liberating because that was something that I wasn't supposed to do when I was in graduate school. And so, I wasn't supposed to, we were dissuaded from writing anything that had, very clear popular or vernacular influence to it. But writing that piece, I really realized how much I loved that freedom. So I strive to I strive to not worry too much about style anymore and just to think about what is the message and the meaning, the emotional connection with the listener.
Mhm.
All of that is much more interesting to me than style.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I have to say I'm with you. I find that these sort of these labels and little silos that we sort of funnel music into, they're kind of arbitrary, you know.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
why is something that maybe sounds like a pop or rock or whatever, like why is that not classical? I mean, they're classical sounding pop things too. I don't know.
Yeah, right.
I
And
think
when you
it's
go back, as you know, into music history, of course, classical music up until the 20th century was greatly influenced by popular music of its time.
sure,
So it was
sure,
really this sort of bifurcation or siloization sort of happened in the 20th century, and
yeah.
I
Yeah.
think a lot of composers are pushing back on that now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and I think that that's great. Um, so I, I think it's in some ways this is the at least the beginning of a good time for composers who are women. I think we're sort of we're having an opportunity to be heard and to be you're getting commissions and and you're writing about issues that are important parts of history, but also important parts of women's history as well. Um, I'm curious to know this is a little bit off topic, but I think it's an important thing for anybody as a professional musician to at least be thinking, and I'm guessing that you have an opinion about it anyway, because we're always looking to find ways to get more people into the audiences, particularly to get more diverse audiences, to try to get younger people in, to try to get people of
Mhm.
color, to have various socioeconomic groups.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know if you have ideas, if you have suggestions, if you have beliefs about how to make the arts more welcoming, more inclusive, both in the audience but also on the stage and in management on the boards. Well, what do you think? Do you have some ideas or opinions about that?
Yeah, I mean, representation is everything. And so I think there are a lot of organizations who've made real positive, forward movement in this area in the past 5 to 10 years. You're seeing a lot more composers of color and various gender representation on stage and programmed. We still have a lot of work to do in that area, but I do think we've seen some good progress. I think we need more people of color and women in positions of power and in administration. Obviously, that is really important as well. So it's programming, it's administration, but it's having these role models, these visible people at the top, who can inspire younger people to see themselves in this field. And that's really the issue is it's a circular problem. So when you don't have representation at the top, then kids don't know how to dream of being there. I mean, that was my problem growing up. I never heard of a female composer,
Mm.
never, and I just thought that was so it never occurred to me that that was something I could do. And yeah, I think that so representation is everything. I also think we need to get over this idea that quotas are bad. There's this idea that if you're programming with quotas in mind, that you're pandering or that quality is suffering. And I think that's a real misunderstanding. And there's so much great talent out there, and there's so much middle of the road music, to be quite honest, that has been out there all the time throughout history because we were enabling anyone who was a white man to do it. Not anyone. You had to, meet a certain bar of quality, one assumes, but by and large, there was just as much mediocrity out there as there would be amongst any, demographic.
Yeah.
So there's always going to be some greatness, some mediocrity, but you're never going to have all the greatness that we can possibly have unless we give it a shot and see what's out there. And when you think about, I mean, it just staggers me to think about how many great masterpieces we've deprived the world of,
Mm-hmm.
that could have been written by women or people of color or whatever, or that are out there and that we don't know of, that the greater public doesn't know of yet.
Mm-hmm.
We tend to think of white men as the only ones who are capable of genius, and that is such a fallacy. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I don't know. I could talk about this all day, but I think we need to, not require so much proof And instead, like with men, there's this idea that men, it's this proof versus potential, where it's like, you know, um, a young white boy who shows promise is often given a lot of opportunities. Whereas, a young person, woman of color, a young girl of color, they don't necessarily make those assumptions, or a young white girl or whatever. And so, I mean, I found this even for myself. Like I had to, really prove, I had to keep citing my record of writing vocal music in order to get this opera commission. Whereas there are lots of men I can think of who had not written very much opera, vocal music even, and were given opera commissions. And so, this is just, we need to get to a point where we're not saying, prove yourself, because
Right.
a person who hasn't been given equal opportunity cannot prove themselves in the same way.
Right, right. It's interesting. Yeah, you've really articulated this well. I think of it as sort of like fishing in a pond, right? Like if we've only been fishing in this much of the pond, it's very easy to say, well, this is the best because this is what we know. But there's
Yes.
that big ocean all around this pond that we've never fished in.
Exactly.
So you
Exactly.
can't
That's a
really,
great
yeah, you
metaphor.
can't really say
Yeah.
that's the best if that's all you know.
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
So I feel like in a lot of ways we're just at the very top of, music history. It would be so interesting in like 1,000 years to be present and see all the great music that's been written,
Yeah,
by all kinds of different people.
yeah,
So,
yeah. Well, I'm gonna leave it there because I think that's pretty profound. I have been speaking on Zoom with composer Sarah Kirkland Snider about her life in music and some of her recent wonderful compositions. Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful and very interesting conversation.
thank you so much for having me, Suzanne. It's really my pleasure.